Chief executives from 4 of the big 6 energy firms were quizzed today on their efforts to support customers during the UK's ongoing energy crisis. Over the last fortnight, millions of households not on fixed-term deals received their first utility bills since the much higher energy price cap kicked in at the start of April. E.ON, EDF, Scottish Power and the British gas owners Centrica were quizzed on what steps they're taking to help households, given that the Ofgem cap regulating the average utility bill just rose by a staggering 54%. From October 2021, the average household fuel bill was capped at £1,277 a year. But after wholesale energy prices surged, that cap was raised to £1,970 from the start of this month, an annual rise of almost £700, affecting 22 million households. With the war in Ukraine and related sanctions still pushing up wholesale energy prices, it's almost certain that Ofgem energy price cap will raise again this coming October. Energy companies told MPs responsibility for helping cash-strapped households should now fall to the government.
Come October, that's going to get horrific. Truly horrific. And it's got to a stage now where I honestly believe the size and scale of this is beyond what I can deal with. It's beyond what I think this industry can deal with. And I think it needs a massive shift, significant shift in the government policy.
That was Keith Anderson of Scottish Power. And when energy companies were previously before MPs, they were asked about raising direct debits unfairly, forcing people onto more expensive fixed-rate deals too. And 2 collapsed energy suppliers, Bulb and Arvo, the former having been nationalised, they also face ongoing questions about money they now owe to customers, having demanded upfront payment. Attention's also shifting to renewable subsidies, which account for around 25% of household electricity bills. Many are asking why customers should pay more now, at a time when bills are so high, to subsidise the transition to net zero carbon emissions. Ministers are signalling these renewable subsidies could be phased out or suspended as long as energy bills stay sky high. Such green subsidies are estimated to cost around £400 per household per year. Cutting those subsidies will infuriate much of the environmental lobby. But it strikes me as pretty obvious. Amidst an escalating cost of living crisis, the priority should now be keeping energy bills as low as possible, not least for vulnerable low-income households. And that's your on-the-money question today, as MPs question energy bosses. Just who is to blame for sky-high household energy bills? Grown-up conversations with people who know their stuff. That's what we do here on The Money. And today we have in the studio Tony Lodge. He is Energy and Infrastructure Research Fellow at the Centre for Policy Studies. Jane Lucy joins us down the line. She's the founder of Labrador, a smart energy switching service. Jane, great to have you back on the show. And in the studio, as ever, lurking on my shoulder is Justin Urquhart-Stewart, co-founder of Regionally and friend of the show. Great to have you with us. Let's go to you first, Jane Lucy, if we may, founder of Labrador. We've seen these energy bosses grilled this morning by MPs, but it is pretty much hot air, isn't it? We're none the wiser where much needed assistance for households opening these often eye-watering fuel bills, wondering how they're going to pay. Who's going to help them?
Well, I think it's there's a number of different ways that there can be savings unlocked for consumers. And I mean, we've heard today that, for instance, the Bulb CEO has been continuing to pay himself a £250,000 salary even after the special administration at a cost to taxpayers. Avro CEO paying himself in excess of £500,000 salary. And as you mentioned earlier, the fact that we've still got environmental costs added to electricity bills where perhaps there's an argument that they would be better placed on gas. So there's lots of different complexities involved. But I think fundamentally we're here today because of a combination of factors, namely price and availability of energy in the wholesale market, and Ofgem regulation forcing suppliers to operate at a loss, and also failing to ensure suppliers are sufficiently financially robust and acting to protect customers. So when you look at those three key drivers, I think the talk about Ofgem regulating more has to be the wrong suggestion, because you've got a history of Ofgem intervening and creating unintended adverse consequences, which is exactly what we're seeing here today.
Tony Lodge, you're from the Centre for Policy Studies. That's a very well-connected think tank in the heart of Westminster. You guys speak to lots of ministers, trying to work out what's going on, chivying them along, trying to shape their thinking. We're seeing now signs that they may scrap these renewable subsidies, which bump up our energy, our electricity bills at least, by 25%. Surely it's time to do that now.
It is time to do that, but there's also a recognition that this is 40 years of hurt finally rearing its head. Bad policy making right since before privatisation, when we got rid of the old CEGB, privatised electricity, privatised the networks. We haven't gone down the route of planning for major, big, robust, resilient plant to take over, closing coal-fired power stations. We had the dash for gas. The long-term planning has been totally removed from this whole sector for far too long. If I told you, Liam, Edward Heath was told in 1972 to go for nuclear. Follow the lesson of the French.
The Prime Minister, yeah.
Then the Prime Minister in 72, who was fighting a battle with the coal unions. Margaret Thatcher was told in 79, go for nuclear, build 10 reactors. She didn't, she built one. Then Blair drops nuclear. We're now, according to Rolls-Royce this morning, going to go very fast for small modular nuclear reactors.
They'll take till 2028, 2030, right?
2030.
Even with government help.
So government needs to accept and find itself in a situation where it is straight with the British people. Attacking CEOs and the rest is absurd and nonsense.
£250,000 he's still paying himself?
Indeed. But is that going to actually bring down fuel poverty levels? I'm not defending that at the moment, but the big picture here is that we've got into a situation where our exposure to factors which the British government can do very little about, whether it is... Don't forget, renewables enjoy a rising carbon price. That is in their interest. So renewables are enjoying a circumstance at the moment which is to their benefit. Environmental levies, yes, should go, but there has to be a straight bat from government to the consumer. There is a situation here where parties of all colours have not been straight with you and have not been taking decisions in the national interest.
Funny you mentioned nuclear, Tony, because I'm delighted we can be joined now by Wade Allison, who's been on the money before. He is an Oxford University professor, a world-class authority in the area of nuclear energy. Wade, thank you so much for joining us here on The Money. It's great to have you on the show. What do you think? You've been knocking around the energy debate for so long, if I may say so, and now people are realising that perhaps we need to go for nuclear like the French have. 70% of their energy is nuclear. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, we should have started this a long time ago, as has already been said. I think people have got to be honest with the British people. This is not about money. You can't heat yourself or run industry on money. What we've got to do is to stop telling people that offshore wind, for instance, is going to provide the answer. I don't know whether I'm allowed to share my screen here. Does that share? No.
Right, Professor Allison.
Hello?
Why don't you think offshore wind will help us, Professor Allison?
Let me tell you, at the end of March, from the 21st to the 28th of March, there's government statistics. Offshore wind, which were totally so marvellous, was actually running at about 15% of nominal. This country cannot run for a week on 15% of its major power input. So offshore wind, forget it. It's a little thing on the side. Onshore wind is even worse. What we need is big nuclear power stations now. Not very adventurous, but at least they can be rolled out more quickly from Rolls-Royce. And then in 15 years' time, we're going to need small modular reactors, little ones, in each city or group of cities which people can identify with and give them the energy that they need and the confidence that they need, because what industry needs and people need is confidence.
Professor Allison, before I bring the other panellists in, I just want to ask you, do you sense that nuclear is becoming a bit more acceptable to mainstream opinion, to the environmental lobby? Isn't it a lot less demonised now than it was even a year ago? Because that's my sense.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with you. But when we're talking about a 25-year timeline and a 25-year failure, 1 year we've got. I'm afraid we're going to have to get very frightened and of a really frightening situation, and the public are going to have to understand what is at stake here.
Do you think the public understands what's at stake? Jane Lucy, you're at the front line. You're helping individual households every day trying to cope with these eye-watering bills.
I do, because they're being charged an awful lot of money. It's pretty hard to ignore that when you're struggling to make ends meet. And, unfortunately for some people, energy is such a basic necessity, it can be life or death, in terms of staying warm and cooking food and keeping food fresh. So I think consumers are very, very aware of what's going on. And I think what the problem is that they're not very aware of what help is out there to help them navigate this, and certainly, not confident that enough is being done to start introducing change.
What do you make of this, Justin?
Do you remember 2 weeks ago we were talking about the economic statement, and the one thing they missed, the key issue that was coming up in everybody's minds? What are you going to do about it? Not at all. And so now actually the government's getting it smack in the face, because this was what was going to happen. This was coming through. You could have actually just announced this beforehand. Meanwhile, you've got Ofsod, or whatever the regulator's called.
Ofgem for family purposes.
Achieving absolutely. They produce a lot of hot air themselves, but no, they missed the fact in terms of the producers they were bringing, in terms of the the retailers that's coming in, who had no experience, no understanding what was going on, and not regulated, and also didn't have to pay the green levy either. That was just irresponsible, amateur stuff.
Ministers are now hearing from the energy bosses, not us, Gov. We can't help people in this tough situation. It falls to ministers, it falls to the government. What have ministers got in the tank, so to speak, to help cash-strapped households?
Liam, one of the most informative bits this morning, which I did watch the session, was Scottish Power, who said the key word here is actually planning. Where is the speed in the planning system to get the new plant, the new baseload plant, as we used to call it, up and running? Why hasn't energy policy got the same priority behind it as we had with beating COVID? That legislation should have the same priority as COVID.
Because as many lives are at stake, right?
Well, there are.
As we go into winter.
Something which must not be ignored is energy-intensive industry. The big steel makers, fertiliser, chemicals, heavy manufacturers, they are hurting too.
A lot of them in red wall seats.
Absolutely.
Tories have to hang on to.
They are hurting too, and there are some extraordinary numbers where steel makers, for example, are paying 60% more for energy than they are on the continent.
Yeah,
These
unbelievable.
are major issues.
Tony Lodge of the Centre for Policy Studies, thank you so much for joining us. Professor Wade Allison, it's been an honour. You'll be coming back on the show soon. Jane Lucy of Labrador, helping people to find better energy deals. She's got a tough job at the moment. Thanks you all for joining me. Justin Urquhart-Stewart is staying with us. Of course, we could debate this for days and days and days. We'll be returning to this subject on the money regularly. But for now, thank you, and we must move on.